The Aegean Sea contains one of the most complicated airspace geometries in the world. Not complicated in the sense of technical aeronautical notation. The charts are published, the frequencies are assigned, the procedures are documented. Complicated in the sense that 2 NATO member states have maintained an active, unresolved dispute over where their respective national airspace boundaries lie for more than 5 decades. And that dispute has produced a situation in which the same coordinates over the Aegean can simultaneously be Greek sovereign airspace by Greek reckoning and international airspace by Turkish reckoning, with neither position conceded by either side, and with both air forces regularly asserting their respective interpretations with live aircraft and active radar. In any given week, the Hellenic Air Force and the Turkish Air Force conduct somewhere between 40 and 100 intercepts of each other's aircraft in airspace that both claim and neither definitively controls. These intercepts are not publicized. They are logged, reported up respective chains of command, filed in a diplomatic record that both governments have been maintaining since 1974, and rarely mentioned in NATO headquarters briefings, because acknowledging them in that context would require NATO to adjudicate a dispute it has specifically declined to adjudicate. The Russian Air Force is aware of this dispute. The flight planning for Su-24 fencer sorties out of Syrian and Black Sea airspace occasionally reflects an appreciation of its utility. At 7:33 a.m. on a Wednesday in late November, a Russian Su-24M fencer climbed from an airfield in western Turkey, not a Russian base, a commercial adjacent field where Russian transport aircraft had been operating legally for several months under an existing bilateral agreement, and turned northwest on a heading that took it into the overlap zone between Greek and Turkish airspace claims over the central Aegean. Its Mode 3 transponder was squawking a code consistent with a civilian flight plan that had been filed the previous day for a VFR ferry flight from Turkey to Bulgaria. Its altitude, 14,000 feet. Speed, 380 knots. Its weapons pylons, as documented by satellite imagery from 3 hours earlier, empty. The aircraft was not armed in any configuration that the imagery had been able to resolve. What it was doing in the disputed overlap zone at 7:33 a.m. on a heading that clipped the southern edge of a Greek island chain whose airspace both Greece and Turkey claimed on different legal bases was not immediately clear from the flight plan. What it was not doing was responding to Athens' approach on 128.5 megahertz, which it was required to do under Greek civil aviation regulations if it was operating in Greek FIR airspace, and which it was not required to do under Turkish national airspace regulations if it was operating in Turkish national airspace. The ambiguity was not accidental. What it generated within 90 seconds of entering the overlap zone was a response from 2 directions. The Hellenic Air Force F-16C at Tanagra Air Base scrambled at 7:34 a.m. in 50 seconds. 1 aircraft. The Greek intercept was based on the Hellenic Air Force's assessment that the Su-24's current position was inside Greek FIR airspace, and that an unannounced military aircraft of a foreign state operating in that airspace without coordination with Hellenic air traffic control required interception and escort under Greek ADIZ protocols. The Turkish Air Force F-16C at Bandırma Air Base scrambled at 7:35 a.m. in 12 seconds. 2 aircraft. The Turkish intercept was based on the Turkish Air Force's assessment that the Su-24's current position was inside Turkish national airspace, a specific zone where Turkey's airspace claim and Greece's airspace claim overlap, and that a military aircraft of a foreign state operating in that zone required identification and escort under Turkish national airspace protocols. 2 NATO air forces, 2 sets of aircraft, 2 legal bases for intercept, 1 Russian aircraft in the airspace between them. The F-35C assigned to the NATO Air Policing mission in the Aegean sector, operating under NATO authorities distinct from either the Hellenic Air Force or the Turkish Air Force national chains of command, received the picture from the E3 sentry at 7:35 a.m. and 40 seconds. The lead was already familiar with the geometry. The CAP station had been positioned with awareness of the overlap zone, the standard Russian approach vectors that transited it, and the established response patterns of both NATO allies when foreign aircraft entered it. What the pre-mission brief had not specified was an exact protocol for a scenario where the Greek and Turkish intercepts were converging simultaneously on the same contact from different bearings, under different national ROE that the NATO Air Policing mission had no authority to override. The F-35C at 38,000 feet over the central Aegean at 7:35 a.m. was operating in a sky that was clear above 22,000 feet and cloud-covered below that altitude, the late November overcast layer sitting flat and gray across the entire eastern Mediterranean basin. The Aegean islands were invisible below the cloud, the blue water and the white-walled villages and the radar installations that both the Greek and Turkish air forces operated on contested rocky outcroppings existed only as symbols on the tactical display, not as visible geography. The cockpit was cold against the canopy glass, minus 52 degrees outside, 18 degrees inside. The oxygen masks hiss the only sound above the airframe vibration that was the F-135 engine's presence without its noise. In this sky, at this altitude, the political dispute over the sea below had no physical reality. It existed only in the symbols on the display and the frequencies on the radio panel and the ROE card in the flight suit pocket. The NATO Air Policing mission's role in this specific geometry was not defined in the pre-mission brief. It had not been defined because the scenario had not been anticipated as likely. The lead transmitted the situation to the NATO CAOC and requested guidance while descending toward an altitude and bearing that would put the F-35C in a position to observe all three contacts simultaneously. Guidance took 4 minutes and 11 seconds. The lead did not wait for it. At 7:37 a.m., the Su-24 was 34 nautical miles from the nearest Greek island in the overlap zone, heading 322 degrees. The Hellenic F-16 was 61 nautical miles south of the Su-24, climbing through 22,000 feet on a northward intercept bearing. The Turkish F-16 pair was 48 nautical miles east of the Su-24 at 18,000 feet on a westward intercept bearing. The convergence geometry placed all three intercept aircraft, the Su-24 and the two NATO national interceptors, in the same 30 nautical mile volume of airspace in approximately 9 minutes. The Su-24 was the focal point of 3 national air operations simultaneously, only one of which was actually Russian. The first friction event in the engagement was not technical. It was geometric. The Turkish F-16 pair's westward bearing and the Hellenic F-16's northward bearing would produce a crossing geometry approximately 12 nautical miles south of the Su-24 at 7:46 a.m., the point at which the two NATO interceptors would be in visual range of each other, on converging headings, in airspace that each country's ROE gave their pilot authority to assert. The history of Aegean intercepts included multiple incidents where Greek and Turkish fighters had conducted close-range maneuvering against each other in the overlap zone. Those incidents were logged and diplomatically managed. They were not operationally predictable. The lead descended to 32,000 feet and turned to a bearing that placed the F-35C's position equidistant between the Su-24 and the convergence point of the two NATO intercepts. Not in the intercept geometry. Observing it. Building the picture with the APG-81 passive mode. 4 contacts, all on established tracks, all closing on a common point. At 7:39 a.m., the NATO CAOC's guidance arrived. It was carefully worded and operationally incomplete. Falcon lead authorized to coordinate between Allied intercepts to prevent close-range maneuvering incidents. Do not take position in Greek or Turkish national intercept chains. Do not issue binding instructions to either Allied interceptor. Use your judgment. Use your judgment. The 6 most operationally demanding words in any mission brief, delivered at 7:39 a.m. with 7 minutes remaining before the convergence geometry became a potential incident. The lead transmitted on the NATO Air Policing Common Frequency, a frequency both the Hellenic and Turkish interceptors monitored at 7:39 a.m. and 32 seconds. All NATO aircraft, Falcon lead on NATO Policing Common. I have all contacts on picture. Converging geometry on Russian contact in 9 minutes. Recommending Hellenic flight maintain south approach. Turkish flight descend to 12,000 and approach from east below 14,000. Recommend deconfliction to avoid simultaneous merge with Russian contact. Advisory only. Both flights have own ROE. Advisory only. The qualification was not diplomatic hedging. It was the operationally accurate description of what the NATO air policing mission could offer in this geometry. Information, situational awareness, and a recommendation that both national flights were free to accept or reject under their own national authority. The Hellenic F-16 pilot acknowledged on the common frequency at 7:39 a.m. and 51 seconds. One word, acknowledged. The Turkish F-16 flight lead acknowledged at 7:40 a.m. and 3 seconds. 2 words, understood, maintaining. Maintaining. The Turkish flight was not accepting the altitude deconfliction recommendation. It was maintaining its current profile, 18,000 feet westward bearing, the same geometry that would produce the convergence. The response was professionally courteous and tactically unchanged. The lead registered the Turkish flight's response and made the next calculation without additional transmission. The Turkish flight's westward bearing at 18,000 feet would place it at the Su-24's altitude band at approximately the convergence point. The Hellenic flight's northward bearing would place it at 22,000 feet at the convergence point, 8,000 feet above the Turkish pair. A geometry that reduced the probability of a visual range incident between the 2 NATO flights while still producing 2 simultaneous intercepts of the same Russian aircraft from different bearings. 2 simultaneous intercepts, both legal under their respective ROE, both professionally conducted by trained pilots, both creating a situation the Su-24 crew was now at the center of. The Su-24 pilot's response to the geometry, visible in the tactical picture at 7:41 a.m., was the indicator that resolved several interpretive questions simultaneously. The Su-24's heading changed. A left turn, gentle, 15 degrees of bank, nose pulling to heading 290 from the previous 322. The new heading of 290 took the Su-24 directly away from the overlap zone, back toward the Turkish mainland, along a route that crossed 0 Greek airspace claims under any interpretation, and stayed within Turkish national airspace under Turkish reckoning throughout. The Su-24 was not pressing the situation. It was withdrawing from it. A Su-24 crew operating with hostile intent against the Greek island chain would not turn away when NATO interceptors were still 12 minutes from reaching engagement range. A Su-24 crew testing the overlap zone's response dynamics would withdraw when the response materialized clearly enough to answer the question. The withdrawal at 7:41 a.m. before either NATO interceptor had reached visual range and before any radio transmission on guard had been made to the Su-24 was the behavior of the second scenario. The timing precision of the withdrawal was itself a data point. The Su-24 had entered the overlap zone at 7:33 a.m. and withdrawn at 7:41 a.m., 8 minutes inside the zone. 8 minutes was sufficient to confirm that the dual NATO intercept response had been generated, that the intercepts were converging from 2 bearings rather than 1, and that the coordination between the 2 NATO flights was advisory rather than command and control integrated. That specific data, advisory coordination, not command integration, was the most operationally valuable piece of information the mission had collected. A single intercept response to the overlap zone was a known quantity. A dual intercept response with advisory-only coordination was a more useful picture for a flight planner designing the next probe. The mission had been a probe. The response had been complicated by the dual intercept geometry, made more complex by the Turkish flight's maintained profile, but ultimately present in sufficient clarity that the Su-24 crew had what they needed. The lead transmitted the heading change to both NATO flights at 7:41 a.m. and 42 seconds. Both flights acknowledged. The Hellenic F-16 began a turn east, maintaining its northward bearing for 30 more seconds, then curving to a track that would allow it to observe the Su-24's withdrawal without crossing into the Turkish national airspace claim. The Turkish F-16 pair descended to 14,000 feet and turned to parallel the Su-24's withdrawal bearing at 8 nautical miles separation. Escort geometry, technically, though the Su-24 had not requested or acknowledged an escort. At 7:44 a.m., the Su-24 was 28 nautical miles from the nearest point of the overlap zone, heading 290, speed 370 knots, altitude 14,000 feet, withdrawing steadily. The Turkish pair held escort position. The Hellenic F-16 held a parallel track, 15 nautical miles south. At 7:46 a.m., the Su-24 crossed back into unambiguously Turkish national airspace, a point at which the Greek legal basis for continued intercept dissolved even under the most expansive Hellenic Air Force interpretation. The Hellenic F-16 broke off at 7:46 a.m. and turned south for Tanagra. The Turkish pair escorted the Su-24 to the Turkish mainland coast at 7:52 a.m. and then turned back to Bandırma. At 7:54 a.m., the lead transmitted. Control Falcon lead. Russian contact RTB Turkish coast. Hellenic flight RTB Tanagra at 7:46. Turkish flight RTB Bandırma at 7:52. No close-range maneuvering incident between Allied aircraft. No ordnance employed. No guard frequency contact with Russian contact. Contact withdrawal preceded any visual identification. Fuel state bingo plus 14. RTB available. The CAOC's response included a request for a full written debrief within 4 hours. The debrief took 3 hours and 40 minutes and was attended by representatives from the CAOC, the Hellenic Air Force liaison, and the Turkish Air Force liaison. It was the longest debrief the lead had sat through since beginning the Aegean rotation. The room had the specific atmosphere of a post-incident review where no incident had technically occurred. The documentation requirements were real, the questions were pointed, and the underlying tension between the two liaison officers was managed with the professional courtesy that both air forces maintained in any joint NATO forum while their governments filed simultaneous diplomatic notes through entirely separate channels. The first finding was the one the CAOC had most needed confirmed. The Su-24's flight plan as a civilian ferry flight had been filed in a format that was technically valid under Turkish civil aviation regulations for a military aircraft on a diplomatic overflight, but which had not been coordinated with Greek civil or military authorities. The filing was legal in one interpretation and a deliberate diplomatic provocation in another. Both interpretations were simultaneously available, and neither was definitively disprovable from the available documentation. The second finding was the operational one that would reshape the mission brief for the remainder of the rotation. The dual intercept convergence geometry had produced a 9-minute window during which 2 Allied aircraft were on converging headings in contested airspace under different national ROE, with no common command authority between them except the NATO Air Policing Advisory Function. The advisory function had been sufficient to prevent a close-range incident this morning. Whether it would be sufficient in a scenario where the national flights were moving faster or the convergence geometry was tighter was a question the mission brief's current language did not answer. The Hellenic Air Force liaison's position on the question: the coordination had been adequate because both national flights had exercised professional judgment. The Turkish Air Force liaison's position on the question, the coordination had been adequate because the Turkish flight had made a sovereign national airspace decision that happened to be compatible with the outcome. Neither position accepted that the F-35C's advisory transmission had been the determinative factor. Both positions were entered into the record without resolution. The third finding was the intelligence one. The Su-24's withdrawal at 7:41 a.m., before visual range, before guard frequency contact, and before either interceptor had entered the overlap zone, indicated a crew operating with a specific objective, testing whether the dual intercept response could be generated and how it resolved, and withdrawing once the data was collected. The objective had been achieved. The response data had been collected. The withdrawal was clean. The Russian crew would have logged the following from this sortie. Dual NATO national intercepts generated in under 2 minutes, both closing on the overlap zone simultaneously. Coordination between them visible on the NATO common frequency but non-binding. Turkish flight maintained its profile despite the deconfliction advisory. Hellenic flight turned away at the Turkish airspace boundary as expected. The data confirmed that the overlap zone produced reliably split NATO responses and that those responses were coordinated at the advisory level but not the command level. That data would inform the next sortie's flight plan. The lead pilot's comment entered into the operational record was 3 sentences. The Su-24 withdrew before either NATO interceptor reached visual range, which means the withdrawal was not triggered by visual acquisition. The withdrawal timing was consistent with a crew that had collected the response data they came for. The overlap zone geometry produced exactly the coordination ambiguity a sophisticated flight planner would design a probe to exploit. The commanding officer noted the comment and added one word in the margin of the printed record: agreed. At 12:30 p.m., the routine diplomatic note from the Hellenic Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Russian embassy in Athens lodging a formal protest of the Su-24's incursion into Greek national airspace was transmitted. At 12:47 p.m., the routine diplomatic note from the Turkish Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the Russian embassy in Ankara noting Turkey's assessment that the Su-24 had operated lawfully in Turkish national airspace throughout its flight was transmitted. Both notes were processed by the Russian embassy staff and filed in the same physical drawer. The Aegean at 1300 p.m. local time was as it always is: blue, disputed, and full of aircraft from 2 allies who had been arguing about who owned the sky above it since before either of their current governments existed. The overlap zone was empty of military aircraft. The charts were unchanged. The dispute was unchanged. The Russian flight planning cell would have the morning's data by the following day. Nothing visible had been resolved. That was the point. 2 Hellenic F-16s. 2 Turkish F-16s, 1 Su-24M, 1 F-35C, 14,000 feet across the central overlap zone, 21 minutes from Su-24 entry to final Allied RTB. Allied close-range maneuvering incident, 0. Ordnance employed, 0. Su-24 probe objective assessed as achieved, confirmed. Coordination gap in dual NATO intercept scenario identified, confirmed. Recommendation for mission brief revision, filed. Response received, pending staffing at CAOC level. The Aegean overlap zone would be there tomorrow. The Su-24 would be there tomorrow. The coordination ambiguity would be there tomorrow. The debrief recommendation would work its way through the staffing process. Some problems in the airspace above disputed waters do not resolve on the timeline of the aircraft that identify them. They resolve on the timeline of the governments that own the aircraft, the lawyers who advise those governments, and the diplomatic processes those lawyers feed. The F-35C could be back on station in 2 hours. The staffing process would take considerably longer. The overlap zone would wait for neither.